I guess we'll perhaps go into just a little bit more detail in a minute about how we got here and what our interest is in the topic we're going to discuss today, which is primary insight. But I think what we felt right from the top, Charlotte, was that the best thing to do probably was to just articulate what we mean by primary insight and just give a few points that we're going to discuss today. So over to you for that one.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So we've got a very limited slideshow. This is more about the discussion, and we're going to welcome any questions that you have. But as Jason said, yes, I'm Charlotte Moffatt. I am leading the primary insight at Armstrong Craven. So yes, what is primary insight? Strictly speaking, it is the insight that we get by speaking to talent. And insight can be anything, talent related in our world. It can be about salary, it can be about EVP, it can be about how businesses are structured. But the primary insight is insight we are getting for the very first time. It doesn't exist anywhere else. Whereas secondary insight, which we also both have teams in that domain, the secondary insight is the insight that already exists online. So it's the insight that is out there. It takes a great deal of skill to find it, analyze it, present it. But that is the fundamental difference between the primary and secondary insight. And they can work so well together. So here at Armstrong Craven, we've got a secondary insight team, a primary insight, and what primary insight can do is really enhance what the desk research, what the secondary insight is showing us, and help to even alter our recommendations. So at a really fundamental level, something that us as executive search consultants, recruiters will be used to asking candidates about is salary. Any salary insight that we get from candidates is insight. So you could look online, a candidate could say, well, I've seen a salary survey, it says I should be paying this is what the market's saying. But how up to date is that salary survey? How nuanced is that salary survey? They could be pitching a cybersecurity manager, but the nearest they can find is an IT manager. Is that comparable? How the primary insight works is when we're speaking to the candidates, we can get that real-time data from the candidates. What are they earning? What is the market saying? What is the projected salary increase over the next few years? If a client has got a particularly strict salary band, what else is going to interest these people? If they wouldn't move for salary, what are the benefits they would want? What are the career path, what are the career path interests of those individuals? So it's about gaining insight to support that secondary and to help make recommendations to our client. So that's a topic that we would find a lot in research and in recruitment, the salary side. I know when we were planning this, Mark, you had a bit of a more interesting example to share about your experience in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's more interesting, but I'll give it a go anyway. Thanks for the build up there. I think what you just said, by the way, about salary data is a really good example of how primary insight shines through, because there's a lot of salary data out there, but is it up to date and is it targeted and focused enough on the subject matter that we're interested in? I think when you mentioned cybersecurity there, that was a great example of something which is a very up to date sort of role, if you like. And salary data in roles like that, in roles like maybe sustainability or within financial services, things like risk compliance, where the landscape's changing all the time. It's really hard to get that sort of information accurately and up to date from secondary data. So you've got to talk to people, and that's why I believe in primary insight. Just coming back to the link, which was a great link, but I've ruined it. The example that I wanted to give was something we did at Henley for a UK manufacturer, global manufacturer. Actually, they happened to be based in the UK. They were looking at locating a new R&D function in Eastern Europe, and they wanted some talent insight into the pros and cons of doing that. So they decided on 3 locations potentially in Eastern Europe. I think it was Krakow, Bratislava, and another one, Brno, maybe. I can't remember exactly. So they just said, can you tell us as much as you can about the viability of doing this from a talent perspective in those different locations? So we looked at the secondary data. So you're looking at stuff like, what does the local labour force look like? From a talent perspective, what are salary rates? What universities are there? What sort of grants are available? But the best research that we could do, and the most yielding and exciting bit, was the conversations we had, speaking to people who knew the answers. So this was people in local government, it was people in inward investment organizations, chambers of commerce and so on. But critically, what we did was we picked half a dozen or so companies in each of those 3 locations. And those were companies, all of them, that had themselves set up R&D functions over the last, say, 3 or 4 years. So they'd been there, they'd got the T-shirt, so to speak. So we spoke to them and they were very happy to help. And we just said, what was it like? What would you do differently if you did it again? What were the mistakes that you made? What were the good bits? What were the problems? And those conversations were absolutely golden. And the feedback, the insight we were able to give back to our client, that primary research and those conversations with people who'd done the hard yards, those were by far the best bits of insight that we could provide in those circumstances. So just, that's one example. Salaries was another that you gave, which is great. But just what we wanted to do now is just very briefly, Charlotte, just talk about how you've got into primary insight, what your sort of journey's been to get to where you are now.
Yeah, so my background, I think Jason mentioned at the beginning, was recruitment. So I did languages for my degree and contacted a language recruitment agency to see if they could help me find a job, and they gave me one. And so I think, like everybody, I sort of fell into recruitment. It wasn't the plan, but sort of had a great time with that company, loved the international focus, and I joined Armstrong Craven in 2011. Again, the appeal was the international focus. And just fell in love with the insight offering. So I was doing executive search and pipelining at Armstrong Craven, but we also had this insight offering, and I was like, oh, what's this? This is interesting. And I'd done a bit of market research at university. So really sort of did the role, sort of dual role of insight and executive search. And then in 2020, they created a dedicated insight and talent analytics function and a dedicated primary insight role, which I took on. And then last year was promoted to the client services manager for primary insight. And now I have a team of 3 under me doing primary insight. So it is a growing function. We're getting a lot of demand for it. And yes, so my background is definitely that recruiter through to insights. And I think you've had a similar journey, Mark.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been in recruitment for some time. So, I mean, just by the way, looking at one of the questions that's just come up, I mean, I think hopefully as this chat progresses, we'll talk about doing talent insight work for its own sake, if you like, but also very much talk about and shine a light on how people doing executive search can really embrace the potential of talent insight to add value to what they're doing for their clients. My journey's in some ways similar, but I go a lot further back, obviously, than you do. I've been involved in doing research interviews for very many years, hence my passion for them, my belief in them. Way back, and you can measure how far back in decades rather than years, I used to work as a research executive in a market research consultancy. And what we specialized in doing was doing market strategy studies all over the world. So we'd work for big corporate clients who wanted to know what was happening in their markets. In Europe, I used to do a lot of work in Germany, but in the Far East and elsewhere in the world. And what we used to do was go and interview people. We'd get dispatched on airplanes, and we'd have to make appointments and speak to very often chief executives of the competitors of our clients, which was quite challenging. But it taught me the value of actually talking to people who knew about those markets. There was less secondary data available in those days anyway, but you could get the secondary data. It told you a part of the story, but really fundamentally, the information you'd get about what were often quite niche markets was by talking to people. So I did that, and then I've moved into Henley 13 years ago, and we offer a whole range of talent insights, talent intelligence, but also talent pipelining, talent mapping, and executive search as well. So slightly different route, but all the foundation of it all was a belief in interviews as a means of getting information fundamentally. So I think what we wanted to move on, just looking at the points for discussion there, was just how executive search has evolved, and maybe this will be relevant to a lot of people who are watching and listening today, who are executive search practitioners first and foremost. I'm aware that not everybody out there offers talent insight as their primary output, and that people are, a lot of people are focused on exec search. But I think they've got to understand the power of talent insight, and And also in our mix, partly responding to Jason's question, the incidence of us doing dedicated insight projects and talent pipelining projects where there isn't a role that currently needs filling, it needs potentially roles might need filling in the future. That's much higher now than it was 5, 6, 7 years ago, where it was predominantly straightforward exec search firms. I do think exec search has evolved to the stage now where search firms who only offer to present a short list of candidates will be struggling increasingly to demonstrate they can provide, value for money. And they will probably be struggling to win searches in the face of competitors who are offering that sort of insight. And if you think about it, the sort of service that exec search firms have offered over the years could be labelled as pretty transactional. We'll give you, we demand a fee for giving you a shortlist, and we'll have another fee from you if we actually place a candidate. And I just don't think that cuts it anymore. I think it's so important that everybody involved in exec search, they've got to deliver candidates, they've got to deliver shortlists, but they need to deliver insight as well. And when we're carrying out a search, we've got that fantastic opportunity to have those conversations with probably potential candidates, but also sources and networks as well. And those conversations, once we've got them, are so important. They're absolutely a golden opportunity to get that sort of insight and to be able to then package that and present it back to our client and add value. But Charlotte, you've got some thoughts as well, I know, on how TA professionals can use insight.
Definitely. When I think of the evolution of executive search, I think the thing that I've found very much over recent years is that internal talent acquisition role becoming more strategic. And so the thirst for insight and knowledge on the market is growing. As Mark said, I think in the past it was quite transactional. We need bums on seats, let's fill the role. Now it's all about the data that we can provide around that. And just to bring that to life, a recent project I did was for a company that was looking to restructure its talent acquisition function. What were the key people it needed in the function? What were the key roles? What were the key metrics they would work to? And what the insight came when we were speaking to some of these best-in-class talent acquisition functions was the fact that these are seen as strategic partners to the business. They are influencing business decisions from the talent data that they are providing. And I think where Armstrong Craven, where talent intelligence, primary insight can really help, is giving talent acquisition the data that can make them look more informed in front of those stakeholders, giving them the ammo to influence those decisions. So if we're working on a search, for example, or a pipeline, or even a pure insight project, we can be asking about salary, as we've discussed, and the insight that comes back may force the decision about, do we need to make an adjustment here? More recently, we've been talking a lot about work from home policy. Companies that we are 3 days in the office, that is who we are, that is our culture. But when we spoke to the markets, like, well, actually, you're not going to recruit for that. People want a maximum of 2 days. They want greater flexibility. That is going to be a barrier to you hiring the talent that you want. And we can prove that with data. We have spoken to this many people. This is the percentage. Even training opportunities, what's going to make this talent join your company? What can you offer? So any insight that we are giving to talent acquisition that is coming directly from those candidates as potential reasons that they wouldn't join a company, what would make a company attractive, is going to be fantastic ammunition for talent acquisition to make the demands they need from their stakeholders. And just to rewind a little bit on what I said there, it's often the non-viable candidates that give us the best insight, those that aren't interested. I think in the past, if you are doing a search and someone's not interested in a role, you might ask for a referral, but then, that's the end of that conversation, the end of that relationship. Whereas with insight, they can be a mine of information. You can run things past them. Okay, this isn't for you. Do you mind hanging on the phone for 5 minutes? This is what our client is paying. Is this in line with the market? What are your thoughts on that? This is the location. This is the work from home policy. And actually having those honest, open chats with non-viable candidates can be a lot more eye-opening than the ones that are being put forward, who may want to present themselves in the best light as well. So always worth thinking about what information we can get from those candidates that we're not progressing. So that's just a little bit on the the evolution of talent acquisition as a function. If we look at evolution even further, my husband asked me the other day, are you not using AI? And that stunned me, because it's never really come up in primary insight. And we had a chat with Mark about it, and I think he had some thoughts to share on that.
Yeah, I did just picking up on what you just said though first, Charlotte, I mean, I think that phrase is quite interesting, non-viable candidates, because that's a mindset, isn't it? I think if we're doing search and they're not interested in a role that we've got, then they're a non-viable candidate. But if we're doing insight, or we're doing a search and we're offering insights as part of what we offer, they're very much a viable respondent. We need to talk to them because their view is just as important as somebody that maybe would be interested in the job. So yeah, and I think things like working from home. I mean, just linking into what you've asked about AI, I think you can ask all sorts of questions of AI as to what the prevailing trends are in working from home. The reality, and you'll get something obviously because it's very, very powerful. But the prevailing trends you will only really get from speaking to people, because they'll be sector specific, they'll be company specific. They'll be very relevant to your client and the exercise that you're going through. So again, that just shows the power of speaking to people who know. And that sort of stuff is evolving all the time. I mean, companies just don't know what their working from home policies are or what flexible working means. It changes every week, every month. So to get an up-to-date view, you've got to talk to people and hear it from the coalface, so to speak. I think we can't underestimate AI. I'm sure that there have been other speakers during the Congress already that know far more about it than I do. And obviously it's developing all the time. So we should never underestimate its potential. But I do think that what we're talking about is tailored information, which we're getting from people who know, what I call informed respondents, people who know. And look, what I wanted to say as well was, as recruiters, as researchers, resources, whatever we are, we've got the skill set to do this sort of insight. If you think about the core skills that we have, the first thing that we're good at, where we're looking for candidates, if you're looking for somebody for a role, is you've got to locate people. You've got to do your mapping. You've got to identify people. So locating the right people is the first key thing. And when you're looking for insight, you've got to talk to the right people. So locate is massively important. Then you've got to ask them to speak to you, and you've got to be very persuasive as to how you speak to them. If you've got a job to discuss with them, obviously you need to hook them in. If you're having an insights discussion, it's the same thing. You've got to create a credible reason for talking to them. So locate them, ask them. When you speak to them, you've got to pose the right questions. You've got to ask the right questions. You know the answers that you want. If you're trying to potentially pursue them as a candidate, you need to ask them the right questions to see if they're a good fit for that role. But if you're doing insight, you know the answers that your client wants. So pose the right questions. So locate them, ask them, pose the right questions. Then you've got to capture the information. You've got to analyze the information. And then you've got to crucially present that information to your client. And that could be a range of stakeholders. If you're dealing with internal talent acquisition people, or maybe even HR people, quite often they're happy to get the information in a fairly rudimentary form, spreadsheets and what have you. If you're presenting to a wider group of stakeholders within the client company, they're going to want it in a different way. They may want to see it in a more accessible format or a more user-friendly format. But I just wanted to say that people out there for whom gathering insight is maybe not something that they would necessarily think of doing every day, not only will it add value to what you're offering in your firm, in your daily work, but also you have the core skills, those fundamental skills, to be able to hold those insights, hold those insights conversations. So just that, I don't know, is it an acronym or something? I don't know. Locate, ask, pose the right questions, capture, analyze, and present the data. I'll put it on the chat. LAPCAP, we call it. That's a pretty handy thing to remember. So Charlotte, the other thing we wanted to talk about now, I think, was just why it's potentially a route for companies to go to use third parties, people like ourselves, exec search firms, research firms, to do that insight work for them. Why don't they do it themselves?
Yeah, I think the main thing is confidentiality, and that's both for the client and the respondent. So on the client side, they might not want the market to know what they're up to if they're planning to do some pipelining or, for a very senior role. They can't go out themselves if that person's still in post. Or if they want to get, some EVP insight on themselves, it might be that people would be more honest with a third party. So there's the confidentiality piece. There's the fact that people might be more open and honest with a third party. Often it's just that they simply can't do it themselves. They might not have the capability as well, that in-house capability to go out and ask those questions. So there's several reasons that they might use us. Just on that competitor insight piece, so just a couple of projects that I've worked on, just to bring that to life a little bit. So we were working for a company that wanted to set up a new business division and basically wanted to copy a different company. But that company was a current client of theirs. So there was a lot of conflict there. They couldn't go and ask them themselves what they were doing. They couldn't, go in and do industrial espionage. They had to find a way to get that information another way. So this is where the insight is one of those projects that's taken a little bit away from talent, and it was more sort of competitor insight. But they wanted us to locate people that had been in that business at certain points, go in and find out, what worked at that point, what didn't, what departments were set up when, how were they set up. And really to understand how this company, how this competitor had been so successful, so we could give some insight back to the client on how they could replicate that. We talked about EVP, and I know Mark's got some examples here of when he's done insight on that confidential basis. But also we were working for an FMCG company, and they were just struggling to attract talent in France, and it was just that location. And they were really struggling to understand, okay, what is it about here? And they thought it was because they were, located on the wrong side of town. It was a bit of a funny commute. And we did prove that. When we were chatting to people, they were saying, yeah, well, we wouldn't really want to make that commute. But actually we got to an underlying problem, that it was a problem with the brand. It's the way that brand was perceived in that country, which was very different to the rest of Europe and the US. And we were able to uncover that, and they hadn't done that themselves. I think a reason for that is if the company had, approached a candidate about a role, they might just say, oh no, I'm not interested, but they might not criticize the company to their face. That's something that they might reserve for a third party. So, they always want, candidates would want to present themselves in the best possible light to clients. So if they have got something negative to say, they might not share it. They might just simply say, well, I'm not interested in that role. And I think that EVP is an important part of, why companies would outsource it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm just picking up on a couple of the questions before I just say a bit more on that. Okay. So we don't get too far behind. Can we tell you how much we charge? Probably not, yeah. It's not a percentage of salary typically, no, because if you're doing a dedicated insight project, you're costing it as a research project, essentially. Obviously, if you're a search firm and your normal charging rate is as a percentage of salary, you may want to add insights into that, so you're creating more value for money. It's an ongoing service that both ourselves and Armstrong Craven and there are other research providers as well, and very good ones that we offer. So it's not a one-off thing. It can be it can be surveys that you do on a sort of tracking basis as well. Somebody's asked whether it's a diversification strategy. I wonder, particularly given the last speaker, whether that's somebody saying, are these added services we can offer as a search firm? Yeah, I think search firms should absolutely be looking at this. I think a lot of them genuinely find it difficult to move away from their traditional search profile and their traditional commercial models. So it's got to be very, very well thought through. But, I would contend, and I would do from where I sit, that it's very important that search firms are offering, as I've said earlier, insights as part of their package, even if they continue to major with exec search as their primary sort of service line. But Charlotte's right about using third parties to get this sort of insight. Confidentiality, as she said, is as you said, Charlotte, is the biggest thing. I think people often find it easier to talk to a third party like ourselves rather than talking directly to somebody who's embedded in a client company. They're likely to be, it's natural, isn't it? They're likely to be much more kind of open about the sort of comments, particularly if there are negative comments that they're going to feed back. And so I think we can capture a lot more information. And I think for us as sort of research professionals, potential external providers, just thinking about how we might approach clients, one thing I think is a lot of companies do recognize, and they talk a lot about the importance of employer brand, what we look like in the market, how we appeal to potential candidates, and how it's so important we get the best people and All this sort of rhetoric is so common. You hear it so often. But so they recognize the value of insight, but very often nobody's ever really defined or allocated responsibility within that company for gathering that sort of talent insight. Talent acquisition people, internal recruiters within companies, that usually their metrics are about filling roles, and they're about filling them quickly. It's not about gathering insight. The reality, though, by the way, is that they often find the insight really useful. If the salary levels for roles they're trying to recruit for, as you alluded to, Charlotte, aren't right, and that sort of talent insight that we can provide can give that company a fantastic steer as to what they should be doing in terms of salaries going forward. But it very rarely falls with TA, this responsibility for talent insight. It doesn't generally fall with HR. That most companies, although it's a growing cohort that do, but don't have talent intelligence functions that are gathering this sort of insight. They may have D&I functions that they're probably gathering it. They may have comms functions, employee comms, that type of thing that are. But generally, this sort of thing falls through the cracks. Nobody's taking responsibility within organization for getting this sort of insight, this sort of primary insight that can drive such a lot in terms of companies' approach to not only getting the best talent in, but retaining the talent that they've got. So I think that's a really important point to make. So we as external providers can make a case for us being the people that get that insight, coordinate it, and present it back to the business. So I think it's a question of just, talking, Charlotte, a little bit about, how we can get that competitor insight. I think you've more or less covered that off so far, but it's about getting those conversations, isn't it, as we said?
Yeah, and I think just to go back, I think to one of the questions that was asked about this diversification in Armstrong Craven, Insight is its own standalone division. So we have separate executive search, pipelining. That is a separate division. So we just do the Insight. And often, if we get a big project, we might need to use people from other divisions to do insight. And the first thing we get, if someone who's a search professional, we ask them to jump on a pure insight project, there's two things. It's like, well, I can't ask that. Or why would they tell me that? So I think it's a flipping mentality. So often with insight calls, we're gathering the same information that we get in typical recruitment calls, things like salary, things like someone's reporting lines, people's career motivations, what they think of the client we're representing. It's about how we position the call and how we present it. So, we would never call someone for an insight call and say, hey, we're a recruiter, we want to talk about a job, but can you just give us some information first? That doesn't work. There has to be full transparency, GDPR compliant, all of that. But often when we approach people about an insight call, it creates intrigue. People aren't used to being approached in that way. So very transparent. We're working on behalf of a company that's keen to see how it's perceived in this market. We're looking to speak to professionals in your industry to gather thoughts on this. Would you be open to a 15, 20, 30, however long it is, minute chat to share your thoughts? People don't often get approached in that way. It is more often a recruitment message. So we find that, having that openness, the honesty, knowing what we're going to ask people, can really help get people engaged. And also, it's not often that people get to sit and have a chat, not about their own career motivations, but actually a reflection on their business, a reflection on their industry. And some people have actually said after the call, do you know what, I've never actually sat down and thought about, why are we structured the way they are? Or, what I think about certain industries or what I think about certain markets or locations. So whatever the insight is, when we really drill down and ask the experts on it, it gives them a chance to reflect and maybe think about their industry as well. And we talk a lot about trade of information. I know that's something you're going to cover, Mark, but it really is a two-way conversation when we have these insight calls.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about way back then, doing those competitor interviews, and we used to trade information then. People go, surely somebody's paying you to get this information. Your client's paying you to get the information. Surely you shouldn't be getting that information, then paying you for it, and then giving it to anybody that needs to know it. No, you're not doing that. Let me just be perfectly clear about that. But what you're doing is you're having a conversation with somebody about a certain aspect of what your overall project is about, something that's interesting to them, something that they can provide an input to. And they learn something from the conversation. You learn something from the conversation. And what you might do is you might then trade some of that information. You might feed back to them some of the findings that you've got that are relevant to them from other conversations that you've got. But you don't compromise what I call the big picture. The big picture is what you give to your client. So I think what you have to do is kind of think of it as maybe like a jigsaw. So your client is paying you and they get the whole jigsaw, all the pieces joined up, the whole picture, the whole jigsaw. Whereas individual contributors, as a thanks for the information they've given you to enable you to get that big picture and do your job, you might be giving them a piece of the jigsaw, but they'll be very grateful for that. And that's the way it works in terms of that trading of information, just to be clear.
Okay.
Okay.
Appreciate we're coming to 5 minutes left, so we'll move on to the final bit, which we just wanted to have a quick conclusion, just some of the key takeaways. So, what can you as search professionals do immediately, implement now, following this training? So the first is, asking questions beyond the candidate screening. So ask more than just the typical candidate questions. What questions can you incorporate into a search right now where the answers are going to give something a bit extra to the client? And what can you ask non-viable candidates who are still, as we discussed, a very good source of insight?
And I think the second one there, second takeaway, reporting insight back to the client. I think there's two things that hopefully it's been clear, but if you're doing search, insight should be part of your offer. It should help you to win the gig in the first place. It should be something that you're offering, and it should be something that the client is wowed by and makes them come back to you for the next search. So you can do it as part of a search, but you should also think, as we do, of these as standalone services where you're offering insight in its own right, because this is such vital information, this primary insight that we can gain to inform your business going forward.
Yeah. In terms of positioning it brings it back to the title of the presentation, getting the information that the clients cannot. What we are giving the client is confidential, non-biased, real-time data that they simply cannot get themselves. We're getting the insight about the market from the talent that they want to hear from to inform their talent strategy. And this can be, as we said, an add-on to a search. And there are ways to price that. It depends on how much information you're giving them, but even sort of a few slides at the end of a search, that you can charge extra for, that would bring together all of the insights that we've got, a deck that they can take away. Again, that's going to be adding value to the search that you've done.
Just to plug, if I may, Jason, before we finish, Jason's company is a primary sponsor to the ERA, the Executive Research Association, which is something that, as he mentioned at the start, I've been associated with for some time, and Charlotte's company, Armstrong Craven, is also a long-standing member of the ERA. The ERA has recently announced what will be, I think, a pretty comprehensive foundation training course and a professional qualification for researchers and resources, which covers all types of primary research, all the stuff we've been talking about and a lot more, I'm sure, and all the other key researcher skills that people need in order to do this very challenging job that we all do. So I would commend that to you. I would recommend that to people just to check out, have a look at ERA and have a look at that. And I think that's something that's really valuable for those, particularly that are quite early in their journey as researchers and resources. I'd heartily recommend that to you. Thank you for letting us just plug the ERA there, Jason. Thank you.
Thank you for your support, both of you, and thank you for your insights today.